This is a recording of the September 12, 2018 Institute for Research on Poverty webinar on Rural Poverty 50 Years After the People Left Behind, which was a 1967 Johnson administration report detailing rural poverty in the United States. This webinar features Bruce Weber of Oregon State University and the Rural Poverty Research Institute and Ann Tickamyer of Penn State University. To learn about upcoming IRP webinars, visit irp.wisc.edu and go to the Webinars page under the Resources tab. Professor Weber is the first speaker.
In the next 20 minutes, I'd like to do a couple of things. First, provide a brief overview of the people left behind, the 1967 report, and then examine some of the important changes in economic and social conditions in rural America in the 50 years since the report was issued, and some of the challenges that still exist. And I'll leave you with 4 takeaways. President Johnson declared war on poverty in his first State of the Union address in 1964. 2 years later, he created his National Advisory Commission on Rural Poverty to make a comprehensive study of the problems of rural areas, including low-income problems, to evaluate existing programs and activities, and to develop a set of recommendations for action. The Commission issued its report entitled The People Left Behind in September of 1967, in which it suggested that the nation had both the resources and the responsibility or duty to eliminate poverty. The Commission found that 1 in 4 rural Americans were poor in 1965. The 25% poverty rate was twice the urban poverty rate of 12%. They found that most rural poor, to the surprise of many, were non-farm rural people, and most were white. They also made a very clear connection between rural and urban poverty and suggested that you couldn't solve the urban poverty problem without attacking also the problem of rural poverty, since the migration of rural poor to urban slums was one of the genesis of the urban poverty problem. The bulk of the report was a series of recommendations that the Commission made. The first task, and I think what they thought was the most important, was creating a favorable economic environment, which essentially is well-paid jobs for everyone, since jobs are the primary mechanism for escaping poverty. They included some recommendations that were quite ambitious, even radical. They suggested guaranteed employment by the government if private sector employment wasn't available. They suggested an end to racial discrimination, higher minimum wage. They also had a number of recommendations that related to investments in people, manpower programs, education, health programs, etc. And they also suggested a need for investments in places, rural housing, area development, and natural resource and conservation projects. And finally, they had a set of recommendations that were for institutional change, for farm policy, for example, which benefited the rural poor, which the current farm programs did not do, and also changes in government activity, government administration that engaged local, state, and federal government more effectively in the attempt to reduce poverty. So the report established that rural areas and rural people were being left behind. So what has happened since 1967? I'd like to look at how economic conditions in rural places have changed over this time period first. And to do that, I'll go back to a map that was created for the report, which looked at the geography of economic distress. In this map, Economic Research Service created an index based on 5 factors, including poverty and low income and dilapidated housing, which looked at economic status of rural people in each county in the United States. This map shows what happens when you divide that index into quintiles. The light areas on the map show areas of low economic distress, and the black areas show the lowest quintile, the areas of economic distress, what you might call the high poverty areas. How has that situation changed since 1960? Tracy Farragon at the ERS produced this map, which shows what the 2010 conditions would look like using the index that was created in 1960, but using 2010 data. What this clearly shows is that most of the counties in the U.S. now have economic status. The rural people have economic status similar to the highest quintile in 1960. There's been a vast improvement in economic conditions in rural areas. And only 4% of the counties have conditions that were like the index in 1960 that had conditions represented by the low quintile index in 1960. So economic conditions have clearly improved in rural areas. The more common map that most of us are used to seeing is income poverty in the U.S., and this map looks a lot like the previous map. The high poverty areas indicated in purple, purple indicates income poverty rate of over 20%, are in the same general locations as historic high poverty places, the South, Mississippi Delta, Native American reservations, Appalachia. So there are still in 2014 high pockets of poverty, and many of these pockets had poverty rates of 20% and over in 2014 have consistently had poverty rates of 20% or more. In fact, have had poverty rates of 20% or more since 1980 and before. The other thing that the people left behind showed was that minority poverty was generally about twice white poverty. This chart shows that those racial and ethnic disparities still persist today in rural and urban areas. Non-metro areas on the left and metro areas on the right. Black poverty is twice, almost 3 times what non-white or non-Hispanic white poverty is, and Hispanic poverty is again about twice what non-Hispanic white poverty is in non-metro areas and in metro areas as well. So economic conditions have improved in rural areas. What about poverty rates? How have they changed over time and why? This next 2 slides show the results of the research of Laura Nolan and her colleagues at Columbia University that looked at rural and urban poverty rates and urban poverty rates since 1967 up to the present, both with taxes and transfers and without taxes and transfers. The top line shows what poverty would have been over these years without the tax and transfer system and the social safety net. Shows essentially that both rural poverty and urban poverty would be either the same or higher than they were in 1967 without the safety net. The bottom line shows the effect of what the poverty rates are with the taxes and transfers that constitute the social safety net. What these lines show is that rural poverty today, because of the expanding safety net, is about half what it would be without the safety net, whereas it was about the same because there was not much of a safety net in 1967. It's today about half. And urban poverty is about 1/3 lower than it would be without the social safety net. This series of graphs shows the official poverty rate and the measure and the supplemental poverty measure. I'm just going to look at the supplemental poverty measure now, which includes, unlike the official poverty measure, the measures of non-cash transfers, income tax credits in resources, and also adjusts the poverty line for differences in costs of housing. What this supplemental poverty measure shows, again, is that rural poverty has about been cut in half in the last 50 years, and that urban poverty rates have gone down considerably since that time. There have been fluctuations related to the business cycle, but generally a downward slope in poverty, rural and urban. But what this, to the surprise of many people, rural poverty under this measure since 2000 is less than urban poverty, which is a new development. So although what we've seen thus far shows that conditions have improved in rural areas and rural poverty is lower than it was in the past, there are some clouds on the horizon. The traditional pathways from poverty, work, education, and marriage have evolved in ways that don't portend well for escape from poverty. The next set of slides, there's a lot going on here, but this is from work that was presented by Jim Ziliak at the conference in March. And the structure of this set of graphs is going to be that we look at urban rates on the right, on the left, and rural rates on the right. We look at men's rates at the top and women's rates at the bottom. There are 4 lines on each of these graphs, but you can get the story primarily by looking at the blue lines, which show rates for over time for college-educated men in these populations, and this for college-educated women, and also the black lines, which show the rates for those who don't complete high school. So the main takeaway from this slide is that educational attainment has, particularly college attainment, has increased rapidly in urban areas for both men and women, and that it's also increased for rural women. But since about the 1970s, there's been no change in essentially no change in the college completion rate for rural men. It also shows that in 2016, the college completion rate for rural men and for rural women is about half of what it is for urban men and urban women. There's been a general retreat from marriage among both men and women in both rural and urban areas at all education levels. This decline has been steeper among those with less education than it is for those with more education, and it's been steeper for men than for women. And by 1916, there was a 30 percentage point gap between college-educated rural men's marriage rates and rural men who didn't complete high school, whereas their marriage rates were about the same at the beginning of the period, there was a 30 percentage point difference at the end. Employment rates have also been declining for men since 1967 and for women since about the 1990s. There's no appreciable gap in employment rates for rural versus urban, except for rural men without a high school degree, for whom employment rates have plummeted. While about 95% of rural males without a high school degree worked in 1967, today it's only about 50% who are working. Okay, so something has happened to the traditional pathways out of poverty, and this depends a lot on educational levels. The other thing to look at is what's happened to the economic environment supporting mobility and supporting escape from poverty. How has that changed? This again is from Jim Ziliak, but the main point here is that the only groups for which wages, real median weekly wages, have increased over the last 50 years have been for the college-educated and for college-educated men, for college-educated women, and also in metro areas, and also college-educated women in rural areas. There's been what this shows is that for everyone else, including rural men with college degrees, the real weekly wages essentially haven't changed since that time. Now, the final thing to look at is income inequality, which has increased dramatically since 1979, which is when this graph starts. This particular slide shows the net incomes of the ratio of net incomes of people at the top quintile or the top 90th percentile to those at the 10th percentile. And this ratio showing inequality of net incomes between the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile has increased dramatically in both rural and urban areas. Urban areas in blue, rural areas in red since 1979 for both men and for women. It has increased slightly faster for urban men and women than for rural men and women. The final map on this is a look at the work of Raj Chetty, which is difficult to summarize briefly, but the point of this map and what you see on this map is the upward mobility of people who grow up poor in each of these commuting zones. So in the red, the dark areas show areas where upward mobility of teenagers who grow up in poor families, that is families at the 25th income percentile. It shows that what their ultimate expected mean income is, the mean income for that group. The mean income for people in the red areas are very low. These teenagers, very few of them escape poverty. Most of them end up very close to where they start in terms of their adult mean incomes. And you can see from this that most of the persistent poverty counties are also, that we saw in the earlier maps, are also places of low upward mobility. Raises the prospect that the people who live in these areas are in a poverty trap, and that there is, I think, some important work to be done to find out what are the barriers that exist for those people. Okay, leave you with 4 takeaways. First, in terms of income poverty, rural Americans are no longer the people left behind. Economic conditions have improved in many formerly high poverty communities. Rural poverty has been greatly reduced since 1967, and in fact, as measured by the supplemental poverty rate, is lower than the urban poverty rate today. The second takeaway is that this reduction in rural poverty is largely due to an expanded social safety net, a tax and transfer system that has been more effective in reducing poverty in rural than in urban areas. However, the main traditional pathways out of poverty, education, marriage, and work, have become roads less traveled, particularly in rural areas over this period. Rural men and women are lagging in their urban counterparts in obtaining college educations. Marriage rates are declining faster for rural families than for those with least education. And employment rates are declining for all, but have plummeted for rural men without a high school degree. And finally, the economic environment that supports escape from poverty, that supports upward mobility, this economic environment is weakened, especially in rural areas. Median wages are stagnating for most of the population. Income inequality is increasing and economic mobility is decreasing. A particular concern are the many persistent poverty regions where many children appear to be trapped in poverty, without prospects of moving out, without access to the human, financial, and physical and other forms of capital needed to escape poverty. We have developed safety net policies that have reduced income poverty in rural America, but we're not developing policies that change the structure of opportunity, that reduce wealth and income inequality, that increase income mobility out of poverty, and that make wage-enhancing investments in people and places. We need to know more about how to change these structures to create quotes, the favorable economic environment in rural America called for by the people left behind. Much of what you saw in this presentation can be seen, and the background papers and presentations can be seen on the website here from our conference. If you Google Rural Poverty Conference, RUPRI Rural Poverty Conference, it'll come up, and you can go to it. Again, thank you, and I'd like to pass this on now to Ann Tickamyer. Ann?
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Bruce, Dave, everyone associated with the webinar. What I'd like to do is present some of the context for the information that Bruce discussed, why rural poverty needs its own research and policy agenda, and what that should look like. What I'm going to do is do a really brief recap of some of the information Bruce presented, ask how do we know this, why should we study rural poverty apart from other forms of poverty, how to do that study, and what do we need to know? What are the research and policy agendas that we need to follow up on and take action on? If we look at a recap, we can see that we can divide it into good news, bad news, and maybe just news. There certainly have been an improvement in poverty rates, a decrease in the numbers and the extent of persistently poor places. However, the bad news is that the poverty rates are still too high. The maps look essentially the same 50 years later, even though they're not quite as extensive. Nevertheless, they have the same patterns. Economic restructuring has taken a huge toll on rural individuals and families, and certainly the rural economy, in part through the decline in labor force attachment and the decline in what used to be much more prevalent working poverty. There's been an increase in deep poverty. There's been a lot of, even though our safety nets have done much to assist the rural poor, there are a lot of failures associated with the welfare reform in the 1990s in rural areas. And the Great Recession has had huge impacts across the country, but especially in many rural places that have really barely recovered. If we look at just news, the shift from rural to urban and suburban poverty, differences in cost of living, and especially, and something that I'm going to harp on throughout this presentation, the diversity of the rural poor. Okay, so how do we know about this? Well, it's not that there hasn't been a lot of research since the 50 years in the President's Commission's report. There's a robust research record on the issue, many excellent studies of rural poverty, but far fewer than efforts to analyze urban poverty or national populations that lack either a spatial analysis or look at very broad regions or states, which obviously contain a lot of diversity. Furthermore, interest in the topic has been somewhat episodic. Rural poverty is periodically rediscovered, and then a new flurry of research ensues. Well, what I've done here is highlight 4 important sources. In 1993, there was a major effort undertaken by the Rural Sociological Society to take a comprehensive view of rural poverty. That report was issued, Persistent Poverty in Rural America. Almost a quarter century later, I and my colleagues tried to do a very similar effort and published Rural Poverty in the United States. And much of what I'm saying here can be found there from Columbia University Press. 2 ongoing things. I won't spend much time talking about it because Bruce just presented a lot of information about the RUPRI efforts, and especially the conference that was held last March. I urge you, if you have a chance, to go look at that website, because there's just a wealth of information there, really important up-to-the-minute studies of rural poverty. And finally, the Economic Research Service of USDA is the go-to source of information on the rural economy in general, certainly rural communities, rural individuals, a lot of information about rural poverty, and that too is a very, very important source, both for the work that we're presenting here and for just ongoing efforts to look at the rural economy. Okay, so why study rural poverty? Is it different? Is it unique? Can't we just, lump it all together with urban and national poverty? And one of the things, the answer is fairly simple. It's different. We've seen that there are reduced rates, but they remain very high, and they still diverge one way or another from urban rates. There are certainly unique configurations of geography, demography, economy, I can add in polity of rural America. And we need to, in order to understand what sources of poverty are there, what the consequences of poverty, and what to do about it, we need to look at those unique factors. And this also covers the diversity of rural poverty. It's not just one type of poverty, one source of poverty, but there are a lot of variations. Okay, so we advance. Other reasons for studying rural poverty is that there are problems in research policy and public opinion about rural poverty. There is the persistence of misinformation about rural poverty. There's the persistence of pejorative and punitive memes about rural poverty. In the past, rural poor were more likely to be seen as the deserving poor. I put that in quotes, in part because they were predominantly white, predominantly working poor, and because of a lot of nostalgia for the country's agrarian roots. Now, however, the same kinds of slurs and epithets that are more or less universally applied to poor people, that they're lazy, that they're undeserving, they're unwilling to invest in their futures, they're welfare chiefs, welfare queens, increasingly get applied to rural poor as well. These slurs used to be seen only for urban poverty. There's also a persistence in seeking explanations in the failings, and this goes back to that last point about the slurs of people who are poor and the lack of understanding that there are different sources of poverty for different populations and places, and that rather than blaming individuals, we need to look at what the underlying causes are. There's a tendency to fail to see the connections across space and place. Bruce alluded to the connections made in the people left behind, and those connections still are important. It's also important not to see it as a competition. It doesn't really, in some larger sense, it doesn't matter who has higher rates. What's important is that all of these different places have high rates, and there are different reasons. And of course, back to the old diversity theme. This is a really important component, as we saw in Bruce's presentation, but we'll see here as well. Why study rural poverty? One of the important things, and can elaborate on the previous point, is the historical legacies that have created such deep pockets of rural poverty across the country. And if we look at a map, this was a map I think that in different variations, and I think this specific one was shown in Bruce's presentation. But if you look at the areas that are shown in pink or in purple, red, depending on how it comes up on your screen, these are the areas of high poverty rates. And what we see is that these, I'm not getting the arrow that I wanted to be able to, oh, there it is. Okay, so if we look, what we see is that the southeastern United States, it has the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. This is the Mississippi Delta and what's called the Southern Black Belt, and these are the historical legacies of policies of discrimination and the plantation economy that was based on slavery and subsequently on Jim Crow segregation. We see in much of the West the colonization and subjugation of indigenous populations. These are the outcome of policies dating back to the earliest years of the nation that dispossessed Native populations from their lands and livelihoods and combined them to reservations. So we see Indian reservations are high pockets of poverty. The resource curse, or sometimes called internal colonialism in Appalachia, is another source of poverty. I don't have time to get into the specifics, but especially central Appalachia, with its high mining-based economy, has been a historical legacy of poverty. Borderlands in Texas and the Southwest of the colonias of settlements of both old line and new and recent Latinx immigrants in substandard housing, lacking basic infrastructure. And finally, in a lot of different pockets across, especially the upper Midwest, but declining there. It's one of the good news is although there has been serious economic restructuring and industrialization over these 50 years, it's not enough to have ongoing pockets of poverty, but it's still quite widespread. So these kinds of historical legacies are still in sway today, and we still see the remnants today in the high poverty areas of the rural areas. Okay, so how do we study poverty? What kinds of theories and explanations should we look to? I'm not going to go into the specific areas. I'm just going to give us an overview of the different approaches, and these can be divided into three separate ways to study poverty. There is the individual level explanations, which look at the characteristics and correlates of people to explain the propensity to be poor, and you see these sometimes cited in cultural poverty theories, human capital theories, status attainment, rational choice theories. Many of these are very useful, but they also focus on the correlates of individuals and the failings of individuals, which doesn't really give us a really strong sense of what's the underlying explanation for these problems. Why is it that racial minorities, women, especially women with female-headed households with children, are more likely to be poor? A second set of theories look at the structural level, characteristics of the institutions and the larger social arrangements that define the constraints and shape the opportunity structure for rural peoples and families. You will see, if you look at poverty literature, theories of economic restructuring, we've seen some of this, globalization and neoliberalism, the fact that we now live in a global economy and one that has particular economic characteristics. Institutional discrimination, we certainly see that in the legacies of segregation and slavery in the South, and variations in power inequality. Finally, there are mixed models, and I would argue that these are the most useful because they're the most realistic and most promising. They combine the individual and the structural level models by connecting social, societal level arrangements with intermediate institutions and processes, and then individual outcomes. And that's really useful for helping explain why you find rural poverty and how you can attack it, how it can be addressed. So what do we need to know? What kinds of research agendas would be useful in going about trying to deal with the kinds of problems that we have seen today? First, I want to go back to the notion that it's really important to look at the links across space and place. As Bruce pointed out, the people left behind made the connection between rural and urban poverty, with rural outmigration fueling inner city poverty. Other aspects of that process, a lack of jobs and services in rural places, have led to a rural brain drain that results in those with the highest skills leaving and leaving behind those who are least able to cope. The recent growth of suburban poverty, partly the result of the expansion of urban and metropolitan areas to include formerly rural places, is important. We need to know more about that phenomenon. Is it an artifact of changing boundaries, or is there some phenomenon that's actually taking place? We also need to be concerned with movement from urban to rural directions also. In the 1990s, an anthropologist identified something that she called Greyhound welfare, where urban social services gave one-way tickets to clients to move out of a big, in this case, New York City, to small towns in upstate New York. It's not clear whether it was to get rid of them or in the belief that they could do better there, but the point is that it shipped poor people out of the city into more rural areas. And also cost of living factors have a huge impact on rural poverty. We've seen the difference between the two different measures of poverty, that it flips the relative size of poverty, but we still don't have a full handle on cost of living differences. The supplemental poverty measure, although it is vastly improved in some ways on the official poverty measure in terms of taking account of taxes and transfers and different sources of income, and also in looking at the cost of living, doesn't fully account for cost of living differences. So, for example, transportation in rural areas is a much higher expense for rural people than in most urban areas, and yet the cost of living, the supplemental poverty measure does not take that into account. So we need more research on those kinds of issues. As I alluded to previously, we need much more work on the intermediate organizations that connect the larger society with outcomes for individuals, because these are the critical means of escaping poverty. Rural communities have witnessed the decline and closure of many of these organizations. Schools are stretched in rural areas. Funding formulas are often to the detriment of rural areas. We've seen the decline of jobs and employment opportunities. Social services often don't have the capacity to deal with rural areas, and civic organizations have also been in decline in rural areas that just don't have the support that they previously had. Similarly with rural religious organizations, which often are a secondary source or a primary source of support for low-income and poor families, and yet many rural churches are struggling. Many have closed. Some have become essentially like circuit riders, where they have services on different weeks as opposed to weekly, or to be staffed on an ongoing basis. So we need to do research on how all of these organizations and institutions can address rural poverty specifically. What can be done to assist them? We also need more in research on poverty and inequality, and I'm not going to go into this, but Bruce shows some of the relationships there, and we need to know a lot more about that in rural areas. What policy and programs do we need to have a better handle on, and what do we need to do? First of all, there are very few social welfare policies that are targeted to rural areas. Lots and lots of policies for agriculture and the environment, but few for rural communities, and there no large-scale rural policy in general is found in many other affluent nations. Some of the we do have some place-based policies. Some of the biggest examples are the Tennessee Valley Association, TVA, and Appalachian Regional Commission, ARC, which have had a huge impact in improving the infrastructure of these areas, providing access to roads, hospitals, opportunities for expansion of all sorts of things. And they've had a major effect on some of those persistently poor areas, but those are pretty few and far between. They take a huge amount of money and a lot of political will, and it's not clear what the future of place-based policies are. We've seen that that there are a variety of policies and programs that have greatly assisted the rural poor. Many of the universal programs, things like Social Security and unemployment compensation, that apply to anyone who meets the basic qualifications, has done a major amount of good in lifting poor people out of poverty. Means-tested programs also have been helpful, but a lot of the programs associated with the welfare reform of the 1990s have really been a failure, or have not been very effective in rural areas, but we don't have adequate research on that topic, and we really need to do a lot more on rural areas. And then there are a lot of sector and industry-based policies, and that is such a mixed record. I'm going to leave that at this point for future discussion. So what do we need to do? First of all, and you'll always hear this from a researcher, we need more and better data, especially on rural areas. The kinds of research, the kinds of data available for national and urban populations tends not to exist for rural communities, so longitudinal rural household surveys tend to either not ignore rural families, rural communities, or to have such limited data that it's really hard to reliably do research and analyze these data. As I've already alluded to, we need to have much greater information on the intermediate institutions and organizations and how they can assist the low-income and rural populations. increasingly we look to big data. We have all these social media data. We have grocery store scanner data. We have huge amounts of Amazon data. All these data that we are worried about invading our privacy are out there and are sources of information. But relatively little, as I understand it, has been geared towards rural populations. So we need to see what can be gleaned from big data about rural America. And then I like to juxtapose that with little data, which are the in-depth qualitative ethnographic studies. We have some really amazing examples of these that show what it means to be poor, what the experiences of poor, why they are poor, how they cope with it. These are some examples, but we need more of these kinds of studies. And we also need refined categories of rural and urban. Our categories are left over from just about 50 years ago or more, and they don't always really capture what is rural and what is urban in a refined way. So data is probably one of the key issues so that we can continue to do good research. We also need to have better research on public opinion and policy formation. This is an area that I think many social scientists have fallen down on. What is it that actually influences public opinion and policymaker opinion? Why is it that no matter how good our research is, there's relatively little ability to communicate our results and respect for the evidence-based policy, so that failed policies, failed solutions keep continually being reintroduced and seen as the solutions for poverty? What are the impacts, the effectiveness of policies and programs by different kinds of places and spaces? How do they vary, not just across urban and rural, but across the different kinds of urban and rural, the different kinds of places that we have seen are the places of rural poverty? We also need information on the impacts, costs, and benefits of devolution and decentralization, because these are the policies that are pretty much in effect now, where programs are basically devolved to states and local jurisdictions. So increasingly, instead of having national programs, we have state programs or local programs, county-level programs, even local community programs. And we need to have better information on what that means. Do these, especially in rural areas, is there the capacity to fund, to design, and to implement these programs? And finally, we need to make sure that we get the engagement of local populations and stakeholders in policy, not just have it be top-down kinds of policies, but also engage the people who may be left behind, whose opinions we need to solicit and pay attention to see what what they think are the solutions. So with that, I think I will leave you with a quote that we ended our book with about what can we be done. And I think the short answer is that we need to continue to struggle. Thank you.